think you have 6 levels of
Correct.
influence, beginning with just ordinary diabolic influence. And I think that applies to all of us, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. So if you look at there's one form of ordinary, and then there's 5 forms of extraordinary. So the ordinary form of diabolic influence is one that affects all of us, and it essentially consists in the demon's ability to introduce things into our imagination, and affect us emotionally. I do go into that even in the book on Dominion. So, but they do have that ability to actually influence us, and that's the lowest level. The next level, the next 5 are what they call extraordinary, and they're extraordinary in 2 ways. One is they're not very common, and they're above and beyond what most people are going to experience. So the first level is, in Latin, it's just called dolor. Sometimes the Italians like using the word vexation. That the problem is with that is that the term vexation can refer to, at least in the literature historically, vexatio can refer to any attack by the demons in any manner whatsoever. So I kind of shy away from using that to refer to this particular kind. But basically, this is the prerogative of saints. It's when the saints would actually be attacked. So we saw this with Padre Pio or the Cure of Ars and the like. So these are the people that were actually attacked physically, and so that's why it's called dolor, which is the Latin word for pain. And so that's the name they give to that. But again, sometimes I've had people say, "Oh, I suffer from this," and then you start digging in and you find out that they're not leading lives of grace or anything, right? So the next one is diabolic oppression. This is where they attack people from the outside. So this is when they attack people's finances, their relationships, their job situation. They can cause problems with their property, destroying certain things. They can even cause death of animals and things of that sort under certain circumstances. And so you'll see those tending to happen. And so that's the one that just deals with it's something external to us. Then the next one is diabolic obsession. That's where they attack the person's psychological faculties. They do it in the same way that they do ordinary temptation, except it's much more intense, it's much stronger. The person usually doesn't have the ability to kind of reason their way out of it or look at it from a different point of view, which is what distinguishes it from temptation. Because temptation, if we stand back and look at it like this is ridiculous and get our mind off of it, we can do that. Whereas with people who suffer with diabolic obsession, they can't seem to think outside the box. In fact, we usually tell people, well, look, if you're being diabolically obsessed, don't try and get clarity in that moment. It's not going to come because the demon has control of your imagination. And all he's going to do is do running commentary. So it doesn't matter what you think. He's just going to keep constantly switching it to what he wants. So you have to attack him and deal with him, and then he'll let up, and then you'll do it. Diabolic obsession and oppression are drastically on the rise in our culture. Primarily, oppression, we're starting to see an increase because of the increase in satanic activity and witchcraft. Obsession, our primary way in which we're seeing an uptick in that is pornography and just lack of moral formation and people just leading their life according to their emotions. Possession is the next one, and that's where the demons actually take possession of a part of the body, unless they're perfectly possessed and it's the whole of the body. They take possession of part of the body. Full possession, the person, you can't tell them. You can't tell that the person's very often possessed, except by what we call some of the secondary signs. And the reason being is because the demon mimics the person's personality so perfectly, it's hard to tell that you're actually talking to somebody who's possessed or not. And the way you know is because of the secondary signs, which is things like malice, duplicity, constantly lying. Everything they do causes damage and destruction, etc. So those are the secondary signs that you would actually see in relationship to that. Whereas most people are what we call partially possessed, and that basically means that the demons possess part of it, but it also means that the demons are only manifesting certain parts of the time, which they call periods of crisis, and then they go through periods of lucidity where the person's normal. So if you look at the case of the exorcism of Emily Rose, if you actually look at the books, don't read the best book out right now, even though I'm still not completely satisfied because I want to know more about her ultimately, because I have a devotion to her, is Annalise Michel, who's actually the exorcism of Emily Rose is actually based on. She went through periods of lucidity and crisis. So during the periods of lucidity, she would spend hours in front of the Blessed Sacrament praying for the clergy at the time, because this was in the late 60s, early 70s when they were just going off the rails. And she was very sensitive to that, and so she actually offered up her possession for that purpose, for the for the clergy, for the conversion of the clergy, so they can go through periods of lucidity. Then the last one is subjugation. That's where people make a pact with the devil. But as I talk about in detail in the book, what is a pact? Because most priests today do not have a philosophical understanding of what a pact actually is. But once you understand what a pact is, you realize that technically speaking, a demon cannot enter into a pact or contract because there are certain requirements that he can't fulfill or meet. But they can convince us that we're under this contract, that we've entered into this pact to keep us subjugated to them. And so people who become perfectly possessed are always subjugated because they've made a pact at some level with the demons. But not everybody who's made a pact is necessarily perfectly possessed or even possessed. I've come across some people that made a pact, and by the grace of God, he kept them immune from possession.
Okay, so the levels are ordinary diabolic influence. Is that the basic level?
That's which we all are subject
Yeah,
to.
that's just, maybe it could be your internal concupiscence. That's not diabolic, but it could be,
Right.
just this voice saying, just to do something absolutely absurd that you would
Right.
normally not be tempted. And it's just like,
Right.
where is this coming from? Okay, so
Right.
that's what that is. And
Right.
what's the best way for us to resist that? Prayer, sign of the cross. How do we just snuff out that voice?
Yeah, there's two parts. One is receiving of the sacraments on a regular basis is the primary thing, and staying in the state of grace. But then also, if you're being tempted in a particular area, that's an indicator that God wants you to work in virtue. So performing the acts of virtue contrary to those particular forms of temptation. Certain forms of temptation is just a matter of custody of the mind, getting your mind off it. Don't stop thinking of it. Don't try and figure it out. Don't just get your mind off it. Get it on something else that is good, wholesome, or at least indifferent morally. And so you just, because, and so you're basically just what you would do with any form of fighting any kinds of temptation, which I think if I remember right in the book on Dominions, even though I spent 3 years writing the thing, when you write something that long, which I'm sure you can appreciate, when you write something that big, you start to forget what you wrote in the beginning. So, but anyway, I do go into how to combat that in the book.
Good.